71 knots.
Space Shuttle. After 3 days in orbit, it glides in for a landing on a dry lake bed in California. Other rocket planes had landed there before. One of them was the X-15, a small, black, rocket-powered, bullet-shaped airplane. 19 years before Space Shuttle, the X-15 routinely flew into and out of space. What was learned with the X-15 helped make the shuttle a success. There had never been anything like the X-15. It had a 1 million horsepower engine and could fly twice as fast as a rifle bullet. The X-15 set records that stood for years. B-52s launched the X-15 so that test pilots could fly the research flights that would lead to Space Shuttle. But the plane and the men who flew it have been overshadowed by the astronauts and the ballistic missiles that shot them into space like so many human cannonballs. These men flew into space. Without the pilots and the plane and the research program, Space Shuttle would not have gotten off the ground. Lindbergh, the Lone Eagle, the first man to fly across the Atlantic. Lindbergh flew the Spirit of St. Louis at just over 100 miles per hour. His achievement was not speed, but daring. For that, he was admired. Speed thrilled people. By the middle 1930s, the national air races were attracting huge crowds. People who wanted to watch tiny planes go faster and faster. A new speed record was set every year. By today's standards, those speeds were laughably slow. But by their standards, the speeds were breakneck, the pilots daredevils. By trying to go faster, those pilots were showing the way to outer space. They didn't know that, but some of them died for it. Many more would die during World War II. Some of them would die on the ground, taken by surprise. Others would die in the air. But the faster you went, the safer you were. Lessons learned by those daredevil pilots of the 30s paid off for the combat pilots of the 40s. Aircraft speeds doubled. But faster planes are harder to control. More young pilots died not knowing that by going faster, they too were taking us towards space at a price. Science and technology responded to the demands of war with new machines and new weapons. And in the air, better performance and more speed. Always more speed. As combat pilots used that new speed, they ran into a new and mysterious problem. Some combat aircraft simply disintegrated in the air, untouched by enemy fire. Now retired Air Force General Charles E. Yeager was a combat ace. He shot down 13 German planes, and he encountered that mysterious problem.
During dogfights with the Mustang, we'd end up, say, at 35,000 feet or higher, and you'd jump a 109 or 190, and if you got into a tactical advantage, they'd always split S and head to the deck wide open, and you'd be chasing them in the P-51. And the maximum speed of a P-51 going straight down wide open is about 80% of the speed of sound. But in these dives, the controls get a little unruly. You'd have turbulent air and buffeting. And that's the first exposure I had to the effects of Mach on an airplane.
Mach, the speed of sound. In the thick air at sea level, it's 760 miles per hour. In the thin air at 35,000 feet, it's 660 miles per hour. But the effect on the plane is constant. As it goes faster, it pushes air in front of it, building waves of pressure, which at the speed of sound become an invisible wall. By the end of World War II, no plane had broken through that wall. Our propeller-driven planes could not go faster than the speed of sound, so planes that had helped to win the war became expensive junk. Even before the war ended, a program started to develop an airplane that could break the sound barrier. The project was headed by Walt Williams of the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics.
We had the world's largest Air Force, but on the other hand, it was totally obsolete. So we went through a period, a little before the war ended, to develop a new Air Force that could fly quite well, efficiently, near and above the speed of sound.
Designers started with the sleek shape of a .50 caliber bullet. On that form, Bell Aircraft built a rocket-powered plane. The work started in March 1945, and less than 2 years later, there was a plane, the X-1. It was the first of a series of rocket-powered aircraft that would take man faster and higher and lead step by step to space shuttle. The steps into space started at what is now Edwards Air Force Base. It was a flight test center located on the high plateau of the Mojave Desert in California, not far from Death Valley. It was isolated and enormous and had the dry lake beds that are nature's perfect runways. The X-1 landed there after its first powered test flight in late 1946. The Bell Aircraft test pilot was Chalmers Goodland, handsome, dashing, and nicknamed Slick at a time when that was a compliment. But in an age before astronauts had agents, Walt Williams says Slick priced himself out of the program. He'd take the risks, but he wanted to be paid to do it. One report says he asked for $150,000, a fortune in the mid-40s. Air Force Captain Chuck Yeager volunteered. He'd take the risks for regular pay, $3,396 a year, $283 a month to put his life on the line attacking the sound barrier. Britain's top test pilot, Geoffrey de Havilland, had died the year before in a similar attempt. His plane disintegrated.
With the X-1, it had been predicted that it would disintegrate too, but I had a feeling for the X-1. Of course, it was a piece of machinery, but that's, you develop a feeling for machinery and a sort of a passion for an airplane when you fly it, and you have to have a great deal of confidence in it. And I figured that the X-1, knowing it like I did, wouldn't bite me or swap ends on me without giving me some sort of warning.
A B-29 carried the X-1 aloft so that Yeager could try to pass Mach 1. He had already come close. When the B-29 reached 20,000 feet, it would drop Yeager in the X-1 to try again. But 2 days earlier, Yeager had fallen from a horse and broken 2 ribs. They hurt and would hurt worse in the turbulence approaching Mach 1. Yeager told no one, afraid he would be grounded, and he wanted to be in the X-1.
We were up about 9.6 Mach number, and our Mach meter only went to 1.0. I don't think they had a hell of a lot of confidence in us those days. we were in quite a bit of buffeting, and the airplane just shook. And then all at once, the Mach meter just jumped plumb off the scale. And at this point, all the buffeting quit, and the airplane just smoothed out, just as slick as glass. And then I just went ahead and shut the 3 chambers off and let the airplane decelerate back into the buffeting.
I called in within 15 minutes, 30 minutes of the flight. Once we knew, had seen enough to know that we had done it. And about 2 hours later, I got a call from the deputy director of NACA telling me that the program was now classified top secret.
Yeager had taken the X-1 to 43,000 feet and 700 miles an hour, just past Mach 1, the speed of sound. It was, by any standard, an heroic achievement. But this was the only parade Yeager got, pulled around on a desert runway by a dusty Jeep. There was no ticker tape parade, no visit to the White House, no headlines, no public adoration. Like Lindbergh, Yeager had helped to change the world. But Lindbergh's accomplishment was public. Yeager's was classified. Those were the days of the Cold War, and this tentative step towards space had to be kept top secret. It was only one step. We would need so many more. In the sky above the Mojave Desert, the Edwards test pilots pushed themselves and their new planes to the edge. If it happened in aviation in the early 50s, it happened at Edwards. That attracted 29-year-old Scott Crossfield, a civilian graduate engineer with a master's degree in aeronautics. Within a year, he would build a reputation as one of the best, a rival to Chuck Yeager. Crossfield did not fit the Hollywood image of a test pilot, but he was cocky, he was independent, and he wanted to be part of the rocket plane program. In 1980, 60 years old, Crossfield went back to Edwards. South Base is deserted now. When Crossfield first got there, it was the center of the test pilot's universe. Despite the popular imagination, test pilots were not wild and reckless. They were methodical, careful, intent on testing planes step by step. The object was to find out what the new jets and rockets could do and stay alive to report it. A lot of them didn't.
We killed 17 people on this base in 2 years. You just learn to hypnotize yourself into putting it out of your mind. If you're given to reacting to fear, you've got no business being a test pilot. And if you refuse to acknowledge, at least to yourself, fear, you've got no business being a test pilot.
The word fear, you really don't consider it as a part of your vocabulary when you're testing airplanes, because we call it apprehension. Number one, when you're involved in programs where the outcome is questionable and where your neck's on the line, it really, you don't look at it as being dangerous. It's something that you're sort of dedicated to, and you just sort of concede the fact that that's your job and that's what you're going to do, and you don't really think about the outcome. And of course, a lot of pilots got killed.
1
saw this kind of high-performance flying only at air shows. For the test pilots at Edwards, it was daily routine. Dangerous, but routine. The goal was research. Find out what each plane could do, what its limits were, and put it into a bland engineering report. On the other hand, no one said setting a record was all bad. Going higher, going faster, doing something today that no one could do yesterday, that's the way the test pilots kept score. In 3 years, Crossfield put in more hours in the experimental rocket planes than any other pilot. And if he was the calm professional in the air, he was not above showing off on the ground. Modest people are seldom, if ever, test pilots. But they are cautious, and if showing off was called for, the ground was the place to do it. It's safe there, or it's supposed to be.
I had made many dead-stick landings with the rocket airplanes on the lake bed, and had perfected a technique where I could land where I wanted, and then I would coast up the ramp and tap the brakes and park the airplane in front of the hangar, dead stick, and that was just a little flourish.
Scott's a pretty good pilot, but he, like all of us test pilots who were flying so many different kinds of airplanes in those days, didn't pay an awful lot of attention to the emergency systems. And what happened, he landed on the lake bed and brought the airplane up onto the ramp and was going to stop it in front of the hangar, but had no brakes, so it went right on through the hangar and the nose stuck right through the walls.
And subsequently, every time he had a chance in public, Yeager would always say the sonic wall was his, the hangar wall was Crossfield's.
There was a rivalry between Crossfield and Yeager. It was most obvious in November 1953, 1 month short of the 50th anniversary of the Wright brothers' first flight. The Air Force wanted to use the X-1A to celebrate. Yeager had taken the X-1 past the speed of sound, and the Air Force wanted him to take the X-1A to twice the speed of sound. The plane was designed to fly that fast, and Yeager decided to try. Crossfield wanted to get there first. He talked the Navy into letting him try for Mach 2 in the Douglas skyrocket. It was not designed for that speed. But whoever reached Mach 2 would be the fastest man alive, if he survived. Crossfield tried first. He and his crew did everything they could think of to make the aging skyrocket faster than it ought to be.
We cold soaked that thing and wiped off every fly speck. There wasn't any excess drag on it at all. And we started loading it 6 or 8 hours earlier than we would, and let that liquid oxygen just soak it till it was so damn cold you couldn't touch it. Your hand would freeze on it anywhere. Good cold morning, miserable morning. I had the flu, the weather was bad.
Crossfield tried and failed 6 times. In late November 1953, he made his 7th and final attempt to reach Mach 2. He either did it this time or let Yeager try. Being second was not Crossfield's style. He would use all his skill and knowledge to take the skyrocket to twice the speed of sound, even if it wasn't supposed to fly that fast. Crossfield fired all 4 rockets and started to climb. He easily passed Mach 1 and kept going. At 72,000 feet, Crossfield put the rocket plane into a dive and hit Mach 2.
It was there, you know. It was something you wanted to do, wanted to be first to do. Particularly if I could needle Yeager about it, that would be like.
At Edwards Air Force Base, Muroc, California, test pilot Scott Crossfield and the needle-nosed Douglas skyrocket. Now, 32-year-old scientist pilot Scott Crossfield, first man to fly twice the speed of sound.
22 days later, Chuck Yeager got his shot at the title, fastest man alive. Crossfield had gone 1,291 miles per hour, Mach 2.005. Yeager wanted to go faster. He did, Mach 2.42. It almost killed him.
As we went through 2.3 Mach number, the airplane began to yaw. Then the outside wings started coming up, and nothing was causing the airplane to respond. And the airplane rolled over, went inverted, and then pitched up. At this point, the canopy busted. And I didn't know really, I couldn't orient myself to up and down. And the X-1A, we had no way of getting out of it either. No ejection seat, so of course I blacked out.
With Yeager blacked out, the X-1A fell 51,000 feet in 51 seconds. The plane spun and tumbled. Yeager was simultaneously pushed, pulled, and slammed around. His helmet cracked the canopy. He came to disoriented, weak, and bleeding. The X-1A was in a deadly end-over-end tumble, an inverted spin. It is usually fatal.
So I just sort of hung on. In this inverted spin, I recovered from that into normal spin and popped it out of the normal spin at about 25,000 feet and looked around, found the lake bed, and glided on in and landed.
Yeager had beaten the sound barrier only to find a second barrier. Engineers called it high-speed instability, a loss of all control at 1,500 miles per hour. Yeager regained control. Crossfield knew why.
It's Yeager's total skill that allowed him to recover the airplane so that we had one to go another day. He was probably fortunate that Yeager was a pilot on that flight.
Yeager is now retired but still flies supersonic jets. In 1954, 1 year after he survived high-speed instability, he returned to regular Air Force flight duty. In 1962, he went back to Edwards to help train astronauts. In those 8 years, Yeager missed a revolution at Edwards. Scientists and technicians had stopped wondering about the sky and started wondering about space. Chuck Yeager was away when the X-2 finally arrived at Edwards 5 years behind schedule. It had been built to fly 3 times the speed of sound, Mach 3, and theoretically it could. Theoretically. September 27th, 1956. Air Force Captain Milburn Apt tries for a record in the X-2. He wants the rocket plane to do what it was designed to do. Fly at 3 times the speed of sound. Captain Apt died, a victim of that neutral engineering phrase, high-speed instability. From the pieces of the X-2, engineers learned that the tail had to be larger. And until it was, no one was going to survive Mach 3. There was a rocket plane that might make it, that might get past not only high-speed instability, but the Earth's atmosphere as well. A plane that might fly into space. But it wasn't ready. So everyone waited for the X-15. The planning had started years before. The X-15 was not another rocket-powered aircraft. It was to be the first rocket-powered spacecraft. The Wright brothers took us into the air. The X-15 was to take us beyond it. Using a 1 million horsepower rocket engine, the X-15 was designed to break away from Earth's gravity and fly into space. It would not orbit. It would go into space and back in controlled flight. The X-15 was being built by North American Aviation, and one of the men working on it was Scott Crossfield. He had left Edwards and joined the private contractor. He wanted to help with the design, fly the builder's tests, and persuade the government to let him take it into space. Crossfield was betting his career that he could do it. Crossfield's boss at North American was the X-15 project coordinator, an engineer named Harrison Storms. Storms knew exactly what he wanted the X-15 to be.
It was the most advanced aircraft in the world. In fact, it still is the most advanced aircraft in the world as far as that goes, even today.
Storms wasn't building the X-15 so that Crossfield or anyone else could fly fast in the clear Mojave sky. He was looking beyond the sky.
One of the most powerful reasons for wanting to do a project like the X-15 is it's one of the primary steps on your way to space, and it's a necessary step.
But there was another way to space. Scientists were working with ballistic missiles. You couldn't fly them, and in the 50s, as often as not, you couldn't launch them either. At Cape Canaveral, missiles were an exotic, expensive, often explosive scientific sideshow. It didn't matter until the fall of 1957. The Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1. It orbited the Earth, its steady beep a constant reminder that we had been beaten.
It was just at dusk, and I looked up, and there was Sputnik. To see that moving across the sky, which was just a point of light, was really an awesome feeling. There was something that I couldn't touch, I couldn't get to, I couldn't do anything about it. I felt a degree of frustration, resentment.
Chagrin, shock, downright embarrassing. We didn't like it worth a damn, professionally.
6, 5, 4...
63 days after the first beep from Sputnik, the United States had a Vanguard missile ready to launch from Cape Canaveral. It would put us back into the space race. There was live national television coverage. At North American, the X-15 program had its own problems. The rocket plane was on schedule, the rocket engine was not.
It became very obvious that we were not going to have the LR-99 engine, the big engine, ready when the airplane was going to be ready. And one, we had underfunded it. We'd underestimated the job of changing this Viking engine from a missile. We wanted it to be throttleable. A throttleable rocket engine had never been built up to that point. So these were very extreme requirements. And we simply weren't getting there.
One of the earlier decisions of the newly formed Space Administration was that ballistic missiles, not winged craft, would be the fastest, least expensive way to put men into space. Attention shifted from Edwards to Canaveral. The test pilots at Edwards said that no one would fly these things, they'd ride them. There would be no pilots, only passengers. October 1958, a year after Sputnik, North American rolled out the first X-15. It did not have the million-horsepower engine. Instead, it used two X-1 engines. It wasn't what anyone wanted. It was the best anyone could do. Vice President Richard Nixon proclaimed it the day that America regained the lead in space. The X-15 had never been in the air. In theory, it would work, but in theory, so did the X-2. and that plane had killed 3 men. Scott Crossfield would fly the tests for North American, but the government had talented, Yeager test pilots ready to take over the controls, and they were young. Yeager was gone. As the X-15 was taken by truck to Edwards, Crossfield was the old pro. He was 38, and he knew the X-15. Perhaps his ambition and the national interest might come together with the controls of an experimental rocket plane just over 50 feet long and 22 feet across. The United States desperately needed a success in space, something to polish a thoroughly tarnished image. Crossfield desperately wanted to try.
We fully understood that we were now under the gun to do something for our country and to really get back our own internal self-confidence and know how good we really were.
Number 1 bearing is 380 degrees. Number 2 bearing is 295 degrees.
1 minute till drop.
Uh-oh. Scott, upper bearing on the number 2, please. Number 2 upper bearing has come up to 295 degrees.
Roger, at a little over 300, shut her down.
Okay, Scott says no drop. He wants to go home.
Raj, I take it as no drop. Is the launch light on?
Negative, I'm not going to drop it.
Right.
Before flight tests could begin, scientists had to know if the X-15 would glide, as it must to land, or drop like a rock. The only way to find out was for a B-52 to carry Scott Crossfield's X-15 aloft and launch it. It sounded so simple. For months, the X-15 was carried aloft and carried back, still nestled under the starboard wing. It had not been launched, not once. Reporters and photographers assigned to cover the X-15 story wrote of frustration and failure. The pressure to succeed increased.
We were on camera at that time, and there was just no question that we were expected to carry the banner. We were very vulnerable to let's say, tarnishing the national image, and we're just determined we weren't going to make any critical mistakes.
With the recent success of Space Shuttle, it is difficult to remember how desperate the United States was in 1959 for any accomplishment in space. The people who worked on X-15 still remember the crushing psychological pressure to give the country something to boost morale. Technicians would work like dogs only to have a launch canceled. They were getting spooked. Crossfield and Storms were getting uneasy.
The whole crew can get a disease called cancelitis. As soon as they come into any difficulty, if you give up, everybody will give up.
It was a tough, difficult airplane to get going. We handled some very atrocious chemicals. It was cold and miserable working out there all night to get it ready. And in the morning, to get the flight going, I very often got in the cockpit, even though it wasn't time, just to let those guys know that we were going to go today. And as long as I sat in that cockpit, I sat there for 8 hours one time, as I remember, well into the afternoon. As long as I sat in that cockpit, they would work their hearts out to get those systems working, not to let me down.
Okay, here we go.
Good morning, Al. How are you this morning?
Right, Scott, how are you?
Fine, I now the pilot's license.
Hello, Chase 1, 2, and 3, 003 is taxiing.
June 8, 1959. So far, the sleek black X-15 has been nothing more than extremely expensive wing cargo. No one knows if it can reach space, or fly, or even glide.
One minute, roger. Data on. Emergency battery on. Central is armed. I'm ready when you are, buddy. Master arming on. System arm light is on. 15 seconds. Stabilizer 0, Scott. 10 seconds. Starting countdown. 3, 2, 1. Release. It's a clean break. Looks pretty good here on a 36,000. JPUs are looking real good. I wish I'd get enough to do a barrel roll here. I feel like a bag in a saddling in, buddy.
In order to glide to a landing, Crossfield had to jettison the lower or ventral fin.
Don't forget your ventral. Okay, we'll like clear the edge of the lake here. All right. So coming off now. Clean separation. Good deal, buddy. Right. Showing 260. 5,000 feet. Oh, she handles nice right along here.
It had gone so well. Then it began to go wrong. Crossfield had to depend on instruments and the chase pilot's instructions to land. But on this first landing, the power control system proved too sensitive. Anything Crossfield did was too much. The closer he got to ground, the worse it looked.
Collapse. Big trim change. Get her down.
Sorry, you're 230 yet.
Here.
Take it easy, the gear.
You got it?
Nose gear down. You're about 30 feet. All right, just hold her steady and you'll settle right there.
Yeah, I have a helicopter take pictures of the skid marks.
It was as true then as it is now. Any landing you can walk away from is a good landing. Crossfield was an engineer, and he suspected that some design error had made the X-15 inherently dangerous.
They couldn't believe the airplane was unstable, and yet, from where I sat, at first glance, it had all the characteristics of a classic pitch instability.
In my mind, there was no question of stability. The airplane had proven stable, it tested stable. I knew it was stable. It was also a first flight. It took a little bit of doing, getting used to.
Crossfield was wrong, Storms was right. The problem was a minor adjustment. To the public, it didn't matter. The spotlight was on Cape Canaveral. NASA named the 7 men chosen to be the first astronauts, those who would ride Mercury capsules into space, then into orbit. Put there not by spacecraft, but by missiles. No one had yet been into space, but the astronauts became instant celebrities. The test pilots at Edwards were forgotten.
I never envied the astronauts. They had a very difficult road to hoe. They were men of some consequence, and they knew how this idolatry was. So I kind of felt I was the first astronaut, or at least was way ahead of them.
September 1959. The first test of the X-15 under power. Flying, not gliding. The fuel is liquid oxygen and alcohol, so explosive that the X-15 is actually an 18,000-pound bomb. Should it blow, Crossfield, the X-15, the B-52, and its 4-man crew would simply disappear. Crossfield had made the B-52 pilot agree that if there is trouble, the pilot will dump the X-15 and save the B-52. That is not heroics, but mathematics. Better to lose 1 man than 5. For this test, Joe Walker of NASA would fly one of the chase planes, and Air Force Major Bob White the other. Both were waiting to take the X-15 into space when North American turned it over to the government.
Hello, Chase 1, 2, and 3, 003 is taxiing.
Crossfield wanted to fly the X-15 to space, but the government didn't want him there. His orders were specific: low and slow, below 60,000 feet, below Mach 2.
Chase 2, tower, cleared for takeoff when ready.
Crossfield could obey his orders only if there was a launch, if the rocket engines fired, if they did not blow up, if the X-15 flew, if no one made a mistake, if the engineers were right, if.
20 seconds. Launch light is on. Got her on 15 seconds. There's a prime look. Looks good as blossom. 7 seconds. 5, count down, Scott. 4, 3, 2, 1, release.
It worked. The X-15's first powered flight was perfect, and to stay low and slow, Crossfield had to hold it back. The X-15 went nowhere near its limits. To celebrate, Crossfield allowed himself 1 unauthorized barrel roll. Nothing went wrong. The first powered flight was perfect. So was the second. The third started as well, then went wrong. One of the engines caught fire.
We got a fire, Scott. Like shut down.
Crossfield and his chase pilots were calm. No one mentioned the obvious. The X-15 could explode.
How much fire we got? Back by the rear of the engine. Prime off. Going to jettison. Am I jettisoning? You're jettisoning. Roger. I'm going to land on Rosamond. I still have a fire warning light. Jettison is still full blast. Only when I hit the center of Rosamond, I'm going to make roughly a 360. Stand by that fire truck over there, Goosey. Okay, I think you can turn now, Scott. Roger.
Coming in nose down, Crossfield could not jettison the fuel. He was heavy, too heavy.
Okay, you can, don't forget to arm your ventral. Ventral coming off now, boy. It's off, and the ventral is off. Roger, it's on the flaps.
The X-15 touched down and broke. The X-15 split inches behind the cockpit, inches ahead of the fuel tanks. Move the split either way, and Crossfield might not have walked away.
There was a design oversight in the nose gear, and that's what caused it to break in two. In fact, it probably should have broken on the first landing that I ever made with the airplane because the deficiency was there.
That deficiency was corrected, and of the next 16 launches, 13 were successful.
Good, Joe, you're on your way.
North Americans' X-15 tests ended. The government's began. Joe Walker of NASA flew the X-15 and Crossfield flew chase in a conventional jet, their roles reversed. The X-15 was flawless. Competitive instincts came back. Be first. Be fastest. Go highest. Head for space. Maybe the X-15 could beat the Russians. Perhaps even beat the Mercury astronauts. Spring 1960. 1.5 years after the X-15 was rolled out, the 1 million horsepower engine arrives at Edwards. Someone has to test it. Someone who knows what he's doing. Scott Crossfield would make the engine do everything it would have to do to carry the X-15 to space. The X-15 was locked in steel grips. Crossfield wouldn't fly 1 foot, but he would be as alone as if he were in the air.
On this sequence.
Those who designed and built the engine were confident it would work.
Call it off, time waste. I can call it because I won't be able to hear you.
But it might explode, and 1 million horsepower would make a big bang.
Okay, Joe, into the pillboxes and close the doors. Art, will you make sure everybody is clear and then come in yourself? Ready. Ed, would you give us a short blast on the siren? Right.
It is axiomatic in testing. Never risk more people than you must.
We are secure.
To test the engine, the only man who had to be risked was Crossfield.
Bang I'd ever heard. It was like being in the sun, and the cockpit and instrument bay was blown about 30 or 40 feet from its original position, and the fire was burning all around. And while I, of course, was concerned, I realized that I was in a structure in the cockpit that was designed to resist heat.
What Crossfield survived was a force 50 times the pull of gravity. He survived because the cockpit had been designed to protect the pilot from that force, and worse. Crossfield had helped design it. And the engine design was good. The explosion was caused by a faulty valve. But the blast was spectacular and attracted attention.
The newspaper started calling. And I tried to calm them down, and I told them to relax. The only damage was the press in my pants. And sure enough, the next morning, an East Coast newspaper had a headline, X-15 blows up, pilot wets pants.
November 1960. Scott Crossfield flew a complete X-15, 1 million horsepower engine and all. It had 3 times the power of a Vanguard missile and burned a ton of fuel in 11 seconds. Crossfield finally was in a spacecraft. It could climb out of the Earth's atmosphere at 6 times the speed of sound.
It was a culmination of many years. That was the flight we'd worked for from the day we first conceived the X-15, and all of the pieces were in place. It was the World Series.
But it was the World Series only if you were allowed to play. Crossfield was not. The orders remained. Stay in the sky, stay out of space. Crossfield did what he was told perfectly. North American had turned over one X-15 to the government and was ready to turn over the other two. Crossfield still hoped that he could take one of them into space. No one knew more about the rocket plane than he did, but plenty of pilots wanted to know. In addition to Walker and White, standing in the wings were Neil Armstrong, John McKay, Forrest Peterson, and Robert Rushworth, all of them eager and able. Crossfield made one last try.
Scotty introduced the proposal that he be allowed to fly the majority of the flights for the government. It would not have been good for all of us if one pilot had done all of the flying. I realize he did that because he really wanted to stay with the program. We all had the desire to fly, and I felt at the time Scotty'd had enough.
He made his choice. He could have stayed at NASA and been assured a chance of doing the high-speed flights, but instead he elected to go to the contractor. I think he was just hoping that the contractor would get the whole program, and it didn't.
December 1960. Crossfield's last flight. Whatever he was going to do with the X-15, he would have to do now or forget. Almost everyone expected something.
I think there were a lot of people at Edwards who felt that Scott might try to cut loose. I had mixed feelings. I knew that if he got the chance, he certainly wanted to do it. But on the other hand, he was a very highly disciplined man. But I know he wanted to make those flights in the worst way.
That's why the restrictions went down. Put it right down in black and white as to what he was supposed to do and expected him to follow it. But in any way we could ensure that.
On the ground, Crossfield could be controlled. In the air, he would be on his own. Across the high desert, men talked about and bet money on what Crossfield would do once he was aloft. Crossfield had been flying the X-15 for 18 months. Of 30 test flights, this was his 14th. But both Walker and White had gone faster, past Mach 3. And White had gone higher, above 130,000 feet. If Crossfield wanted his name in the records, he would do it this time or not at all. All Crossfield had to do was put slight pressure on the throttle, and the X-15 would set any record he wanted. Crossfield's orders would prevent a record. But this was his last flight. If he disobeyed, what more could anyone do to him? On the ground, people looked up to see what kind of Hollywood finish Crossfield would put on his flights of the X-15. On his last flight, Crossfield did what he had done on all the others. He obeyed orders.
There's a lot of people that think of a test pilot in terms of a guy that goes out and lays his life on the line and goes for broke with the scarf flying and all that. The people who were making bets that I would open the X-15 up, but they didn't know me. There just was no way that could happen. I got just about all out of it any man could get out of a single program. You can't ask for it all, you know. I got all 8 yards. Didn't get to 9 yards, that's all.
The 9th yard would have been to fly the X-15 into space. Crossfield did not. Other men would. Crossfield's work, his flights, had made that possible. Colonel William Knight was one of the pilots who followed Crossfield. Now vice commander of the Edwards Test Center, he established a speed record in the X-15 that stood for 13 years. But the goal was space research.
It was a hybrid airplane. It was rocket-powered. It was capable of flying outside of the atmosphere, in the atmosphere, and going faster than anything we had ever flown before. We were looking at what it would do to the pilot, what it would do to the airplane. All of those things were unknowns.
In 1961, NASA and military pilots started toward space in careful, calculated, controlled steps. 14 years earlier, Chuck Yeager had first flown at the speed of sound. Now, that was slow. Only one flight in 1961 was below Mach 2. Faster and faster toward space. By the end of the year, Major Bob White would take the X-15 above 200,000 feet and would go faster than 4,000 miles per hour, above Mach 6. Those successes were overshadowed before they were achieved. Yuri Gagarin of the Soviet Union not only went into space, his capsule made a single orbit around the Earth, putting the United States behind again. The X-15 could not match Gagarin's achievement, nor could the ballistic missiles. A month later, Mercury astronaut Alan Shepard made a suborbital flight. A missile shot him 116 miles up, 302 miles downrange. It won a commitment from the president.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth.
Stole the show. The public imagination was captured by the thundering, fiery precision of them. Broadcast live. It was the show of the decade. Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, success on success. July 17th, 1962. Major White flies the X-15 into space and flies back. Only a few people notice. In the next 5 years, 7 X-15 pilots will routinely fly into space, do research for the Gemini and Apollo programs, and fly back. The X-15 was the space program's workhorse. The ballistic missile was the thoroughbred, racing for the moon. October 1967. Pete Knight is given a new research project. The job will make him the fastest man alive or kill him. Knight is to test the effect of high-speed aerodynamic heating. The X-15 is fitted with extra fuel tanks and sprayed with a heat-resistant coating. Knight's job is to push the X-15 to 4,000 miles per hour. Scientists know the airstream will create enormous heat. They don't know precisely what that heat will do. Knight reached more than 4,500 miles per hour.
And as we did that, we burned off the lower ventral, we burnt the ramjet off. The temperatures were getting so high and we were burning things out faster than I could have probably taken care of.
The protective coating failed, but during the test, Knight reached 4,520 miles per hour, a record. Knight's record would stand until the space shuttle. In the 1981 World Almanac and Book of Facts, Knight's name is not mentioned, not at all. Six weeks later, November 15th, 1967, an X-15 pilot was killed, the only one in 9 years. Major Michael Adams died trying to come back from space. His ground control officer on that day was Pete Knight.
Because of the malfunction, one of the displays was giving him erroneous information. And so as it turned out, as he went over the top, he got the airplane turned around 100 degrees. So he actually re-entered the atmosphere backwards. The airplane then went into a classical spin, actually broke itself up as it re-entered the atmosphere, and he was never in a position to eject or get out of the airplane safely.
October 1968. The X-15 program ends. There had been 199 flights to find answers the space program needed. 12 men flew the X-15. Scott Crossfield was first. William Dana was last. Pete Knight went more than 4,500 miles an hour. Joe Walker went more than 67 miles high. Michael Adams died. And there it ended. No more would the X-15 blaze across the desert sky. But the information from the program was being used to develop something new. From the time of Greek mythology, men have dreamed of flying, of commanding the sky. Only recently have they dreamed of commanding space, of flying there. And they have. 34 years after Slick Goodland landed the X-1 on the dry lake bed at Edwards, the space shuttle landed there. The X-1 led to the X-15, the X-15 to the shuttle. And the shuttle could make space as useful as the Wright brothers had made the sky useful. If so, the way was paved by the X-15 and the 12 men who flew it. Robert Crippen and John Young, who flew the shuttle, knew that.
The experience that we gained from an aerodynamic standpoint, energy standpoint, and basic early rocket technology was the kind of thing that made the space shuttle possible.
And the lift-to-drag ratio of the space shuttle is almost identical to that of the X-15. very similar programs with a good deal of feedback into the space shuttle, and it really paid off.
Crippen and Young became our newest heroes. We showered them with ticker tape and adoration. Charles Lindbergh, who flew the Atlantic, got much more. Chuck Yeager, who broke the sound barrier, much less.
I think people need heroes. Sometimes they're hard to come by. I think that because John and I had an opportunity to do something unique, and people were looking for something they could grab hold of and have a positive kind of effect on them, that at least for a short period of time, we were put in the hero world.
That's the way this world is now. We're in the future right now. Everybody's going to be famous for 15 minutes, and we're on minute about 14, and that's the way things are. That's the way it's handled in the media and everywhere, and that's the way it's going to be from now on. And that's all right. That's fine.
So much has happened in our lifetime. We forget too easily and too quickly. It was only 78 years ago that an automobile made the first trip from coast to coast. It took 71 days. Now it takes 5 days round trip to the moon. We celebrate what we have done. We forget who did it. We keep the machines. We discard the people. In today's world of high-speed change, how long would Charles Lindbergh have held our imagination? We expect success. We assume technology will make it possible. Advanced machines eclipse the men who control them. Did Chuck Yeager break the sound barrier, or did the X-1? Do we look up to the man or the machine? Before these machines led us to space, we lived in a time we could more easily understand, even share. We could imagine being in the sky with Lindbergh. We might even have been able to do what he did. Maybe. No more. Perhaps what has happened in our lifetime will be seen more clearly in the future. Machines took us into space. They would not have, had not man conceived them, designed them, built them, and flown them. Most importantly, no machine would have been in space had not some person dreamed of going there. Machines do. Men dream. From those dreams, we build the American adventure.
NBC News produced this program and is responsible for its content.